You know, I'm not gonna list any of those because actually I think every single one of them would get me marked by the YouTube algorithm. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today. And for this video, we are gonna be doing my February wrap up. All right, before we get into anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments how many books did you get read in February? Because even though it was the shortest month, I actually felt like mine was pretty productive, which is ironic because like halfway through the month, even though I had actually read a fair amount, I was looking at my wrap up feeling like I hadn't read anything. Yet now looking at some of these books, I'm like, wait, I read that in February? It's been a weird month, apparently. Though I suppose I can't say thank you to the 72 hours in the reading nook because that definitely helped me work through a few last minute books on my TBR. So before we jump into any reviews, first let's start off with my stats for the month. I read 12 books, and across those 12 books, I read 4,023 pages. That does include converting audiobook hours to pages, but in regard to audiobook hours, I listened to roughly 59 hours of books. My average rating was still decent, but a little bit lower than last month with 3.75 stars, and unfortunately, I did have 3 DNFs. For my genre breakdown, I had 2 fantasy books, 1 historical, 3 horror, 1 manga, 4 romance, and 1 sci-fi. For my series stats, I unfortunately did start into 2 new series. I continued into 2 others, I DNF'd 1, and then I finished out 2. As for the little goals I keep for myself, I technically did read a book that was over 500 pages, so it feels very wonky saying so because it was a audio drama. So the physical version of the book has over 500 pages in it. The audiobook, however, was only about 6 hours. But you know, I'm counting that. At this point, I haven't quite finished it, but I did read a nonfiction book and I did also read a comic or manga. Just a little reminder, when it comes to my wrap-ups, I only talk about the books that I did not talk about in specific reading vlogs. If it comes to a traditional weekly vlog, that is fair game. But if it is a themed vlog, for example, my 5x5 that came out, I'm not going to talk about any books that I read this month relating to that video, rather go watch the video itself. As for ranking this month, I thought let's go through by genre. So starting at the top, let's talk about my manga, which was Spy Family Volume 10 by Tatsuya Endo. This officially caught me up on the series, unfortunately, but thankfully the 11th comes out in March. This one, as you can tell from the front, is focusing mostly on Twilight, or Lloyd, our spy character. And I really like getting to see a little bit of background around him, seeing some growth of his character and exploration as to why he got into this sort of work, and also how he became so good at it, why he is passionate to try and prevent this war between these 2 warring nations. There's also setup for Yor, the wife character, to become more prevalent, specifically for the mission Lloyd is actually on. So that's very interesting to see how that is going to come into play later on. Then of course, you know, Anya, the daughter, is just doing her best. She's trying to get through the day by day in this school where she doesn't really care that much, but she also is trying to help her papa and trying to ensure his mission succeeds. Across the board, I really liked this one. I do think it actually did develop a little bit more of the plot while also growing the characters. So this one came out to a beautiful 5 stars. Then jumping into the horror books I read this month, which was many, I started things out with Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. And this was actually the book that came from my TBR jar, my digital TBR jar, which was a book 10 plus years old. Worked out very well, seeing as how this was also on my 2024 TBR for the book I added to my Goodreads TBR the longest time ago. How many times can I say TBR? Anyway, choosing this book got it off a lot of lists. Unfortunately, I wasn't the biggest fan. This book is following a man who was once upon a time this big name metal rocker, and he has since retired, is a collector of all these really macabre things. Let's see, what are a few examples? You know, I'm not going to list any of those because actually I think every single one of them would get me marked by the YouTube algorithm. He collects all this really dark stuff. One of his most recent acquisitions is a suit that a man was supposed to have died in and also is currently haunting. However, it turns out the suit is a lot more haunted than our main character Jude is really expecting, and it starts to have way bigger repercussions on his life than he ever could have thought. I think the idea of this book is actually quite good, and I do believe Hill could really create very unsettling, creepy atmosphere. There were a few scenes in this that I do think were very well done. When it came to plot, I felt like so much had happened, and yet there were still like 200 pages left in this book, and I just didn't understand how. But really, the biggest issue I had with this is a terrible character. I don't mind unlikable characters, but I need to be able to root for them, and I could not root for him. I didn't feel bad for him. I thought he was a incredibly unempathetic asshole. There's a few allusions to something in his past, some dark secret, something he has repressed for years and years and years that is going to come out. I assume Hill was laying the groundwork to sort of explain why Jude was this way and to help us better understand how he became so jaded. First off, I totally guessed where that was going after looking at spoilery reviews. That's an explanation, but it's not an excuse. Plenty of people have experienced those things and aren't complete dickheads like this guy is. I just really couldn't see myself ever rooting for him to survive. And then I was even more annoyed because his live-in girlfriend that he really doesn't think their relationship's gonna go anywhere, and neither does she apparently. It seems as though no love is lost between the two of them, and yet she sticks around, and when he decides to go on a road trip in order to escape this ghost, she goes with him, and I just didn't understand it. She had no self-preservation tactics when, once again, nothing in this relationship was worth her staying. I think I was about 150 pages into this, and I just had no investment, and on that, decided to officially DNF it. Maybe I'll try more of Joe Hill in the future, but I really don't know about it. I don't know, we'll see what the future holds in that regard. The next book that I picked up, I am going to constitute as horror, but it also is very much like a historical story. The Gilda Stories by Jewelle Gomez. This book came off of my 12 Recs by 12 Friends, and I was really intrigued to see if I would like it because all I went in knowing was that it was about a Black lesbian vampire. Unfortunately, this was not the new favorite I was hoping for. In this story, we were following this young girl who was a runaway slave and is taken into the care of this woman named Gilda, as well as her partner Bird. And eventually, she is turned into a vampire and ends up taking on the role of Gilda herself. And we basically follow her living through multiple centuries. I really liked how Gomez wove the ongoing themes of racism in these multiple different timelines throughout the story. And as far as the vampire element goes, I really liked the dichotomy of Gilda being a vampire, somebody who inherently has to hurt people in order to survive, while also being this very caring, empathetic, kind person. Because we follow so much of her life, we get to see the different connections she makes with people in her time and the difference between those connections and how they impact her. I also thought the parallels between Black people and queer people with a vampire was also very clever and really well done in the story. However, throughout the whole book, I never felt settled with Gilda's character. Perhaps it's because this is third-person perspective and we alternate between multiple different characters' viewpoints, some of which I really don't think were actually necessary. Maybe I was wanting more emotion. I don't know. I really had a hard time putting my finger on what it was in the writing style that kept me from connecting with Gilda, but something did it. When I started looking into this book initially and I noticed there was a lot of marketing around the fact that this is a lesbian vampire story, I was really thinking that romantic relationships were also going to be at the forefront of the book, but they're really not. There are 4 major women in Gilda's life that we see, and I actually had an issue with how every single one of their relationships were portrayed to us. Finally, with this book spanning hundreds of years, there's very little attention paid to the atmosphere or the setting, which I thought was really odd. There's lots of discussions about Gilda's lifestyle in each of these time periods, but I think if there had been a little more attention paid to the setting, it would have allowed the audience to get more settled into the story and also have a better understanding of what Gilda's life was like at this time. Yeah, I loved the ideas of this book and I really liked the themes talked about in it, but in execution, this was not a fave for me. My compile came down to about a 3.5 stars on this, and I would still recommend it for an early Black and sapphic vampire story, but didn't exactly get me what I was wanting. However, that one went better than this next book, Sister, Maiden, Monster by 𝗖cie Snyder. I also picked this up off of my 12 Recs by 12 Friends. I really didn't go into this book with super high expectations, if I'm being honest, just because I'd heard a lot of mid and negative reviews, and I can see why. This is a pandemic story, and you can definitely tell that the author was influenced by COVID. I did think the cannibal twist on the pandemic, interesting. That got me intrigued, but the writing style in this book was so info dumpy at the beginning, and then the main character's thought process just felt very stilted and not really authentic, not very realistic. But as the book continues, I started to notice that it came across really preachy, and even though I agreed with what the author was presenting and what I assume their position is on these thoughts based on the writing, I just didn't like how those issues were being handled and inserted into the story, some of which didn't really feel necessary. I will admit admit some of the gripes I have about this book are definitely based in my own personal experiences, and I just didn't like how Snyder was treating those situations. It just, so I decided to DNF this about 29% in. If you want further thoughts, go check out my 72 hours reading vlog because I ranted in there for a little bit. The final horror book that I read this month was whalefall by Danielle Kraus, and also on my 12 Recs by 12 Friends. I went into this book having heard that it was very similar to Project Hail Mary, except, you know, in a whale. And then there was a lot of grief horror elements in it. And that pretty much sums up what this book is. When I first started into it, I actually was very invested because it kind of read like a long form Am I the Asshole? And I love reading those. The main character, Jay, had a really rough relationship with his father growing up, but now that his father has died and they never ended up reconciling it, he's really starting to feel guilty, and his family is definitely not making that any easier on him. So utilizing the knowledge he's learned from his father about diving, he decides to try and collect his father's body in order to sort of assuage his own guilt, but also showcase to his family like he's not as heartless as they seem to think he is. However, whilst diving, he ends up getting swallowed by a giant sperm whale, where the terrifying bits come in. I did go through a phase when I was younger where I was really fascinated by the ocean and whales. So when it came to facts in that regard, all over this, really liked that. Once we had hit that bit in the plot, I do think the author's writing style was very oppressive and really unsettling. You felt claustrophobic in this story. But that's also when Jay's flashbacks, remembering his relationship with his father, really kick up. And so you alternate back and forth between seeing more about his relationship with his father while also he is trying to get out of the sperm whale. And I felt like this book really dragged from then on. I think the author needed to focus more on him trying to get out of this whale and then maybe return to these flashbacks and explore more around the relationship. I also just wasn't very satisfied by the ending of the story because we don't really get any satisfying conclusion about his relationship with his father or how his family has responded to this. And that's what I was wanting. In the end, this was a very interesting idea for a book. I just don't think it really stuck the landing, so it came out to about a 3 stars for me. This next one technically falls under the horror category, but honestly, I felt like the horror bits were really underutilized, which is why I had it listed as historical in my personal stats. Lone Woman by Victor Lavelle. This is set in 1900 Montana, in which we're following this woman Adelaide, who is going to try and be a homesteader there because the Montana government didn't specify that the owner of a land has to be a white man. She is also dragging along this giant, insanely heavy steamer trunk, and we don't know what's in that steamer trunk. Another one where I really liked the idea of this book, especially when it came to the steamer trunk element, but by the end of this, I felt like the storyline was kind of lackluster and it just dragged a ton. I think the question of what's in the steamer trunk was answered too quickly, and this is one of the few situations where I didn't mind that Adelaide knew something and was purposefully keeping it from the audience because I was so intrigued. But not long after we get an answer to that, the story actually kind of pushes away from Adelaide and we start to see different perspectives of other people in this town who are also homesteaders and the different plots that are all taking place there and how they all intertwine. I did appreciate that there were some little reveals with the side characters to kind of keep me interested. As I said, I love familial drama and that sort of stuff, but I wasn't nearly as invested in those characters as I had been in Adelaide. Then there's the finale. You sold me a horror book, and yet in the climax, you jump over all of the horrific elements and just have the characters see the aftermath. What is the point in that if it's a horror book? As far as characters go, I did like Adelaide as a character, and I was invested in the relationships she was developing with these different people in the town, even though it is very ironic. She's expecting to be alone, to be completely reliant on herself, and yet every single chapter at first, she's constantly meeting somebody new. Another person is showing up at her doorstep. For being in the middle of nowhere, she sure has a lot of visitors. And then again, around the halfway point, we shift to alternating between multiple different characters, and there just was way too many of them. So in the end, this was fine. I liked the idea of it, and I liked, again, some of the themes tied into it, but as a horror book, it was very unsatisfying. It came out to 3 stars. Finally, to end things off on a positive note, when it comes to the single romance book I'm going to be talking to you all about, that was Bending the Rules by Christina C. Jones, which closed out the Wright Brothers series, and I am so glad that the series stuck the landing. It was so freaking good. This one closes out the Wright Brothers relationships by following Justin, the middle brother, who is an author, and he was previously best friends with Tony. However, something happened about 7 years ago that caused these two to have a major breakdown in their friendship, and they don't really speak anymore. But now Justin is a big name author, and Tony's parents actually own the small bookstore in their town, while she also owns a publishing company. So she agrees to work with him to do a signing event because it'll be really great for him, it'll be really great for the bookstore that her parents own, and also her own publishing company. But that also means they have to interact. She has to be slightly cordial with him, which she really doesn't want to. But also they must now admit the fact that it's been 7 years, and damn, that 7 years looks good on both of them. I love the family in here. They're so much fun. Seeing Jay and Joe roasting the crap out of Justin because of his feelings for Tony was so fun. I was a little nervous when it came to the drama in the past. I didn't know if the author was going to make it something where I agreed that Tony had the right to be that angry for that long, but also didn't completely demonize Justin in my eyes. And I do think she managed to do that, but it relied a little bit too much on miscommunication for my taste. However, the relationship between them was so good. The ex-best friends to lovers, delicious, loved that. Apparently a trope I actually really enjoy because they're trying to heal. They're trying to get things back to how they used to be. But at the same time, there's this delicious sexual tension between the two of them that is getting harder and harder to ignore. In Tony's perspective, we also do see some discussions around fertility issues. And then in Justin's perspective, he is a single parent. So I really liked both of those and how the author handled them, especially at the epilogue. There were little things in each of their character backgrounds to kind of give them side stories. Justin has officially finished out his contract with his current publisher and kind of just trying to decide what's the next step he wants to take, while Tony is reeling from breaking up with her fiance. And I really liked how both of those were done and then tied into the relationship plot also. Across the board, had a fantastic time with this book, ignoring that little bit of miscommunication drama. So my rating for this came out to 4.5 stars, and I cannot wait to read more of Christina C. Jones' work. All right, y'all, so that is it for today. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. And while you're down there, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me a ghost emoji in the comments. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me linked in the description. I come out videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!